Year 10. Lennon's troubled childhood shaped his music and his attitude toward life. Long before the screaming fans, the stadium tours, and the flashing lights, John Lennon's life started with chaos. Born on October 9, 1940, during a German air raid in Liverpool in the middle of World War II, his entry into the world was dramatic enough to foreshadow the stormy life he would lead. His father, Alfred, was mostly absent, a merchant seaman who drifted in and out of his family's life. His mother, Julia, was fun-loving but unstable and unable to provide the kind of consistent upbringing a child needed. As a result, young John was raised primarily by his Aunt Mimi, a strict but dependable figure who tried to keep him grounded. This fractured upbringing left John with a mix of emotions that would echo throughout his music and personality. On one hand, he craved love and stability. On the other, he learned early to put up walls of sarcasm and wit to protect himself. Many who knew him said he often seemed to wear a mask, alternating between biting humor and deep vulnerability. That contrast later showed up in his songs, where he could move from biting social commentary in Working Class Hero to raw tenderness in Julia, a song written about the mother he adored but lost tragically when she was struck by a car when John was just 17. Imagine being an American teenager in the 1950s, listening to music for fun while worrying about high school exams and maybe a part-time job at the diner. Now, picture John Lennon in Liverpool, grappling with abandonment, trauma, and the need to find his place in a post-war society rebuilding itself from rubble. Music became his lifeline. Rock and roll, imported from the United States with stars like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard, electrified his imagination. He wasn't just listening, he was studying, absorbing, and plotting how to make his voice heard in a world that often ignored kids like him. That hunger, that edge, gave Lennon a sharpness that never left him. His childhood taught him that nothing was secure, that you had to fight to be seen and heard. It explains his later clashes with authority, his defiance of norms, and his refusal to play it safe. Without that troubled beginning, the John Lennon the world came to know, the dreamer, the fighter, the Beatle, might never have existed. Likert 9. Lennon almost didn't make it as a musician until Paul McCartney walked into his life. It's hard to imagine a world without the Beatles. No Hey Jude, no Let It Be, no screaming girls at Shea Stadium, no British invasion changing American culture forever. But here's the surprising truth. John Lennon almost didn't make it. In fact, without a fateful meeting with Paul McCartney, Lennon might have ended up just another kid with a guitar and big dreams that never went anywhere. Back in the late 1950s, Lennon had formed a skiffle group called the Quarrymen. Skiffle was this quirky mix of folk, blues, and jazz, often played with homemade instruments like washboards and tea-chest basses. It wasn't glamorous, but it was cheap and accessible, and for working-class kids in Liverpool, it was the gateway into making music. John was the leader, but let's be honest, he wasn't exactly disciplined. He loved to play, but he was more about attitude and showmanship than precision. That's where fate stepped in. On July 6, 1957, at a church fair in Liverpool, Lennon met Paul McCartney through a mutual friend. Paul was younger, but he blew John away with his ability to tune a guitar perfectly and play songs note for note. When Paul casually showed he could play 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran, Lennon knew right then he had found someone who could take the band to the next level. It wasn't easy for John, who was used to being the undisputed leader, to admit he needed someone else. But he made a decision that changed music history forever. He invited Paul to join the Quarrymen. That partnership, sometimes harmonious and sometimes explosive, would become the heart of the Beatles. Their songwriting rivalry pushed each of them to greater heights. Think about it like American sports. When Magic Johnson had Larry Bird to challenge him, or when Tom Brady had Peyton Manning across the field, the competition made both better. Lennon and McCartney worked the same way. They weren't just bandmates. They were creative sparring partners, sharpening each other's skills and feeding off one another's energy. Of course, the story didn't stop there. Paul brought in George Harrison, who at just 14 impressed Lennon with his guitar skills, and later Ringo Starr completed the lineup. But none of it would have happened without that summer day in 1957, when a cocky teenager with a guitar and a knack for melodies met a sharp-witted leader searching for someone who could match his ambition. For John, that meeting wasn't just luck, it was destiny. Without Paul, John might have been stuck playing skiffle in Liverpool pubs. With Paul, he became part of the greatest band the world has ever known. It's one of those sliding door moments in history, the kind that makes you wonder how different the world would look if that one introduction had never happened. 8. The Beatles' U.S. debut made Lennon a global icon. Almost overnight, in February 1964, a Pan Am plane touched down at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City, carrying 4 young men from Liverpool. Among them was John Lennon, dressed in a sharp suit, hair in that now famous mop-top style, and a sly grin that said he knew the world was about to change. What followed wasn't just a concert tour, it was a cultural explosion. When the Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, more than 70 million Americans tuned in, making it one of the most watched television broadcasts in history at the time. For John Lennon, this was the moment he stepped from local fame into global legend. Imagine being in Times Square, where neon lights already screamed for attention, and suddenly seeing Lennon's face on every newspaper, magazine, and TV screen. America was in the grip of Beatlemania, and Lennon was front and center, delivering his cheeky one-liners in press conferences and flashing that rebellious charm that separated him from the other band members. It wasn't just about the music, though the music itself was revolutionary. Lennon's stage presence stood out. While Paul often came across as polished and friendly, John gave off an edge that felt dangerous but magnetic. Reporters would throw questions at the band, and Lennon would often answer with biting wit. For example, when asked how the Beatles found success, he quipped, "We were just 4 guys. We made it because we loved the music, that's all." But behind the humor was a deeper truth. Lennon's charisma wasn't something rehearsed. It came from that same survival instinct he learned in his rough childhood. To put it in an American context, think of Elvis Presley shaking up television in the 1950s or Michael Jordan taking the NBA global in the 1990s. That's the scale of Lennon's arrival in the United States. He wasn't just a British rock star, he became part of American identity almost instantly. Fans screamed until they fainted at concerts, girls chased cars down the street, and critics began to realize this wasn't a passing fad. John Lennon and the Beatles were here to stay. But fame came with a cost. Lennon admitted later that he felt trapped by Beatlemania. In his words, it was like being in the eye of a hurricane, everything moving so fast you couldn't stop to breathe. Still, this global debut cemented his place in history. Without it, he might have been just another talented singer from England. With it, he became the face of a generation. 7. Lennon's controversial, more popular than Jesus remark sparked outrage in America. If Lennon's arrival in the U.S. made him a superstar, one infamous comment nearly tore that image apart. In March 1966, during an interview with a British journalist, Lennon reflected on the role of the Beatles in culture and casually remarked, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. We're more popular than Jesus now." At the time, in England, this statement barely caused a ripple. But when American media picked it up months later, it ignited a firestorm. To understand why, you have to picture the cultural landscape of 1960s America. This was a country still deeply rooted in church traditions, where Sunday service was as common as Friday night football. For many Americans, hearing a rock star, especially a foreign one, suggests that a band could be more popular than Jesus wasn't just arrogant, it was blasphemous. The backlash was immediate and intense. Across the Bible Belt, churches organized record burnings where Beatles albums were thrown into bonfires. Radio stations banned their music. Parents pulled their kids from concerts. Some fans who once screamed in adoration now held picket signs calling Lennon an enemy of God. Even politicians jumped in, using the controversy as a way to score cultural points in the middle of a divided decade. For Lennon, the reaction was overwhelming. He insisted his words were taken out of context. He wasn't boasting about the Beatles' greatness. He was criticizing the decline of religion among young people and pointing out the uncomfortable truth that more kids were obsessed with pop culture than with church. Still, the damage was done. The Beatles' 1966 U.S. tour became their last, partly because of the chaos and threats triggered by this comment. And yet, in hindsight, this controversy revealed something deeper about Lennon. He wasn't afraid to speak bluntly, even when he knew it would cost him. His entire life was marked by moments where he refused to bite his tongue, whether it was about religion, politics, or war. In a way, the Jesus controversy was the first public glimpse of Lennon as more than a rock star. It showed him as a thinker, a provocateur, someone who would use his platform to question society. If you're American, think of moments when athletes or entertainers made statements that shook the country beyond their profession, like Muhammad Ali refusing to fight in Vietnam or Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem. Lennon's comment belongs in that same category. It wasn't just about music, it was about identity, belief, and where society was heading. The fury eventually cooled, and the Beatles went on to release groundbreaking albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the White Album. But the scars of that summer remained. Lennon had learned firsthand that fame gave him a voice, but it also came with responsibility, and sometimes consequences. Hectics. Lennon and Yoko Ono's bed-in for peace turned a honeymoon into a global protest. By the late 1960s, John Lennon was no longer just a musician. He was becoming a global activist. One of the most unusual and unforgettable protests he ever staged was the bed-in for peace with his new wife, avant-garde artist Yoko Ono. The concept was as strange as it was simple. Instead of marching in the streets, they invited the world's media into their hotel room, where they stayed in bed for days, talking about peace. The first bed-in took place in March 1969 at the Amsterdam Hilton during their honeymoon. The couple spent a full week sitting in bed, wearing pajamas, surrounded by flowers and handwritten signs that read things like hair piece and bed piece. Journalists and photographers packed into the room, expecting scandal or spectacle, but instead they found Lennon and Ono calmly preaching nonviolence and urging the world to give peace a chance. Literally. That phrase became the title of one of Lennon's most famous solo songs. They repeated the stunt later in Montreal, where they recorded the track Give Peace a Chance with a crowd of visitors singing along. What's fascinating is how Lennon used his celebrity in a way no one else had before. He wasn't performing music in a traditional concert, he was performing an idea. By turning a honeymoon into a protest, he blurred the line between private life and public activism. To Americans watching on TV, this was both bizarre and brilliant. Some dismissed it as a publicity stunt, while others admired the creativity. Think of it in terms of modern celebrity activism. When NBA players wear shirts reading, "I cannot breathe," or Hollywood stars use the Oscars stage to speak about climate change, they're doing what Lennon pioneered, using fame as a megaphone for social issues. Of course, Lennon's bed-ins were criticized too. Many accused him and Ono of being naive, thinking a week in bed could change the world. But Lennon himself admitted that wasn't the point. The goal was to capture attention and get people talking, and in that sense, it was a massive success. Newspapers across the globe ran the story. Millions who never paid attention to political protests suddenly saw two of the most famous people alive lying in bed, demanding peace instead of war. The bed-in remains one of the most iconic moments in Lennon's life because it illustrates his evolution. He was no longer just a Beatle, no longer just a musician, but a man determined to use his fame for something bigger than himself. Number 5. Lennon became an enemy of the U.S. government and faced deportation. While the bed-ins revealed Lennon's political side, they also marked the beginning of a much darker chapter, his battle with the U.S. government. By the early 1970s, Lennon and Yoko had moved to New York City, where they quickly became involved in the counterculture movement. They rubbed shoulders with activists, spoke out against the Vietnam War, and even planned concerts to encourage young people to vote against pro-war politicians. This caught the attention of the Nixon administration, which saw Lennon not just as a musician, but as a political threat. The FBI began monitoring his activities, tapping phones and gathering files that later revealed just how seriously the government took him. Officials feared that Lennon's influence over millions of young voters could swing elections. To silence him, they tried to deport him. The official excuse was a minor drug conviction Lennon had back in England, but everyone knew the real reason: politics. For 4 long years, Lennon fought deportation in U.S. courts while under constant surveillance. Imagine being an American citizen in the early 1970s and learning that your government was spending taxpayer money to spy on a rock star because he sang about peace. It sounds absurd, but that's exactly what happened. Lennon didn't back down. He hired top lawyers, gave interviews exposing the government's tactics, and gained support from celebrities and politicians who argued that deporting him was an attack on free speech. Eventually, in 1976, after years of legal battles, Lennon won the right to stay in the United States. Ironically, just a few years later, many of the same people who once wanted him gone celebrated him as an adopted New Yorker. This fight with the government cemented Lennon's role as more than an entertainer. He became a symbol of resistance, proof that music could be powerful enough to scare those in power. In a way, he mirrored the struggles of other American icons who challenged authority, figures like Martin Luther King Jr. or Muhammad Ali, who also faced harassment for speaking against the status quo. For Lennon, living in New York wasn't just about making music. It was about living at the heart of the cultural and political storm. The city gave him energy, anonymity at times, and a sense of freedom he didn't feel in England. But it also made him a target. The fact that the world's most famous musician could almost be deported for his beliefs is a reminder of just how threatening art and speech can be when combined with courage. 4. Lennon's solo career proved. He was more than just a Beatle. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, fans around the world were devastated. For a generation that grew up with She Loves You, A Hard Day's Night, and Yesterday, the idea that the band was finished felt unthinkable. Many wondered if the individual members could succeed on their own, or if the magic only worked when they were together. For John Lennon, the breakup was both a heartbreak and an opportunity to prove that he wasn't just one-fourth of the Beatles, but an artist with his own voice, his own vision, and his own power to change music. His first major post-Beatles album, John Lennon, Plastic Ono Band, released in December 1970, shocked listeners with its raw honesty. Unlike the polished pop of the Beatles, this record was stripped down, emotional, and deeply personal. Songs like Mother confronted the pain of his childhood, while Working Class Hero became an anthem for disillusioned youth. Critics were stunned by how vulnerable and confrontational Lennon was willing to be, laying his life bare in ways rock stars rarely dared. Then came Imagine in 1971, an album that cemented his solo legacy. The title track became one of the most iconic songs ever written, a timeless plea for peace and unity. Even today, you can hear Imagine played at memorials, protests, and major global events. The song transcended Lennon himself, becoming almost a universal hymn. For Americans, it echoed the hopes of the anti-war movement, resonating in a decade scarred by Vietnam and political turmoil. Lennon's solo career also showed his versatility. He could go from soft and introspective tracks like Jealous Guy to biting political statements like Jim Me Some Truth. He wasn't chasing chart success, he was chasing meaning. And in the process, he proved he could stand alone without Paul, George, or Ringo by his side. Think of it like Michael Jordan leaving the Chicago Bulls. People wondered if his greatness only existed because of his teammates. Lennon showed, like Jordan did, that even when separated from the dynasty, his individual brilliance still shined. The Beatles gave him a platform, but Lennon's solo career gave him his own identity, one that still echoes decades later. Number 3. Lennon's Lost Weekend was a chaotic but creative period. For all his brilliance, John Lennon was far from perfect. In fact, one of the most turbulent chapters of his life is what he later called his Lost Weekend. Despite the name, it lasted about 18 months, from 1973 to 1975, when Lennon separated from Yoko Ono and moved to Los Angeles. During this period, he lived with his assistant May Pang and dove headfirst into a lifestyle of drinking, partying, and reckless behavior. Stories from this time are legendary in rock history. Lennon was frequently seen at Hollywood clubs, sometimes drunk to the point of being thrown out. He was photographed wearing a U.S. Army jacket, dark sunglasses, and a dazed expression, looking more like a rock cliché than the thoughtful activist people remembered. There were wild parties with other musicians, including Harry Nilsson, where Lennon's antics often made headlines. At one point, he even got into a drunken brawl at the Troubadour nightclub, heckling the Smothers Brothers during their show until he was kicked out. But here's the twist. Despite the chaos, Lennon was also surprisingly productive during this time. He worked on new music, collaborated with artists like Elton John, and recorded the album Walls and Bridges, which produced the hit single Whatever Gets You Through the Night. That song even reached number 1 on the U.S. charts, proving Lennon could still dominate musically even while spiraling personally. One of the most memorable moments came in 1974 when Elton John invited Lennon on stage at Madison Square Garden. The crowd went wild. Nobody expected Lennon to appear, and the concert became one of the most legendary in rock history. For many fans, it was a reminder that despite his troubles, Lennon still had the magic that made him unforgettable. The Lost Weekend also showed a more human side of Lennon. He wasn't the untouchable icon people imagined. He was flawed, struggling with relationships, fame, and addiction. For American fans watching him stumble through Los Angeles nightlife, it was both shocking and relatable. It's a reminder that even legends wrestle with demons. Eventually, Lennon reconciled with Yoko in 1975, ending the Lost Weekend chapter. But in hindsight, it wasn't truly lost. It was a period of growth, experimentation, and hard lessons. Like many Americans who hit rock bottom only to climb back stronger, Lennon used this low point as fuel for the next stage of his life: fatherhood, reflection, and ultimately, some of his most heartfelt music. Iker Dahu. Lennon stepped away from music to be a stay-at-home dad. In 1975, after reconciling with Yoko Ono, John Lennon welcomed his second son, Sean, into the world on his own birthday, October 9th. For Lennon, this was more than coincidence. It felt like destiny, and it completely changed the trajectory of his life. Having missed much of his first son, Julian S.'s upbringing due to the chaos of Beatlemania and his own immaturity, Lennon was determined not to make the same mistakes again. So he did something shocking. He walked away from music at the peak of his fame. For 5 years, he became what he proudly called a house husband, focusing entirely on raising Sean and supporting Yoko's career. He cooked meals, baked bread, and even learned to make elaborate Japanese dishes to connect with Yoko's heritage. Instead of being on stage, Lennon was reading bedtime stories, changing diapers, and strolling through Central Park with a stroller. To fans, it was almost unthinkable. Imagine if LeBron James decided to retire right after winning a championship, or if Beyoncé suddenly vanished from the stage after releasing a hit album. That's what Lennon did. And yet, it showed a different kind of courage, the courage to prioritize family over fame. American fans who spotted him in New York during this period often described him as surprisingly approachable. He was seen walking around the Upper West Side like any other dad, wearing simple clothes and blending into the city. For Lennon, this wasn't about running from fame, but about embracing a quieter, more meaningful life. He once said, "I'm not the man who sings, I'm the man who brings up the baby. This period also reflected his deep personal growth. He wasn't just the rebellious Beatle anymore. He was a father who wanted to break the cycle of abandonment that haunted his own childhood. And though fans were hungry for new music, Lennon's absence only made his eventual return more powerful. In 1980, he came back with the album Double Fantasy, sharing songs about love, partnership, and the simple joys of domestic life. The album wasn't just a comeback, it was a window into the man he had become. By stepping away, Lennon showed that true greatness isn't just measured by records sold or concerts played, but by the impact you leave on the people closest to you. Era 1. Lennon's tragic death shocked the world and turned him into a martyr for peace. On December 8, 1980, the world lost John Lennon in one of the most shocking and heartbreaking moments in music history. That evening, Lennon and Yoko were returning to their apartment at the Dakota in New York City after a recording session. Outside the building, a disturbed fan, Mark David Chapman, shot Lennon multiple times. He was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital but pronounced dead shortly after. He was only 40 years old. The news spread instantly, and the reaction was unlike anything the world had seen before. In America, millions of fans stayed glued to their radios and televisions, stunned by the senseless loss. Crowds gathered outside the Dakota, lighting candles, singing Beatles songs, and weeping together. Across the country, from New York to Los Angeles, spontaneous vigils broke out. Even major TV networks paused their regular programming to cover the story non-stop. It wasn't just fans who mourned. World leaders, fellow musicians, and even rivals paid tribute. President Jimmy Carter issued a statement praising Lennon's contributions to music and peace. Artists from David Bowie to Bruce Springsteen expressed their grief, and radio stations played Beatles and Lennon songs on repeat. In Central Park, a sea of people came together for a silent vigil, where Yoko asked for 10 minutes of quiet reflection. The silence of hundreds of thousands in the heart of New York was deafening and unforgettable. For Americans, Lennon's death felt like the assassination of a president or a civil rights leader. It was more than the loss of a musician. It was the loss of a cultural icon, a man who had given voice to a generation's dreams of love and peace. His murder turned him into something larger than life, a martyr for the ideals he sang about. Imagine! Already a timeless song, now carried even greater weight, played at memorials and protests around the world. The tragedy also highlighted the dark side of fame, the way obsession and violence can intrude into the lives of public figures. To this day, fans debate what more Lennon could have accomplished had he lived. Would he have continued to push boundaries in music? Would he have become an even louder voice for peace during the turbulent 1980s? Those questions will never be answered, but they add to the myth surrounding him. What we do know is that Lennon's legacy didn't end on that cold December night. It lives on in the music, the activism, and the spirit of defiance he embodied. From Liverpool to New York, from small clubs to sold-out stadiums, from cheeky Beatle to outspoken activist, Lennon's story is one of constant reinvention, vulnerability, and courage. His life may have been cut short, but his influence continues to ripple across generations. John Lennon's journey was anything but ordinary. He was a boy shaped by loss, a young man defined by rebellion, a partner in the greatest band the world has ever known, and later a solo artist and activist who dared to imagine a better world. He made people dance, he made them think, and sometimes he made them furious. But above all, he made them feel. That's the mark of true greatness. And while the facts of his life can be listed, they don't tell the whole story. The real truth about Lennon is found in the emotions he stirred and the conversations he sparked. Conversations about peace, love, freedom, and the power of art to challenge the status quo. If you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with your friends so more people can discover John Lennon's fascinating story. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next deep dive into the lives of history's most unforgettable icons. Your support keeps us going and helps bring more legendary stories to life.